Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we take a closer look at the top political stories of the day. Ballotpedia connects people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for being with us. Over the next 2 weeks, you can expect to see us in your feed a little more than usual with a special series we're calling RCV Explained. As ranked choice voting gains more attention and more ballot measures and bills aim to expand, limit, or ban RCV, we're here with everything you need to know. Across 4 episodes, we're going to look at what RCV is, how it works, its track record, the arguments in favor and against, and where it's headed in 2024. Today, I'm joined by Ballotpedia staff writer Joe Greaney to take a look at how ranked choice voting fared on the ballot in 2023 and take a look ahead to what initiatives have started gaining traction for 2024. Joe, thanks for coming on the show today.
Super happy to be here, Victoria.
How's post-election season treating you?
Yeah, doing well. Definitely had a wave of work. We did a lot of, I know you've talked about this on the podcast, but we did a whole lot of expanded school board coverage this year, which I got to help out with a little bit. It was my first time covering school board elections, which was super fun. And now, we're getting ready for 2024 on year. It's going to be a marathon, I think.
Definitely. We are doing this ranked choice voting special, and I brought you on as our Ballotpedia expert on ranked choice voting. We have some other people talking about the arguments, because obviously Ballotpedia doesn't take a stance on this issue, but I brought you on to kind of define RCV and then talk about the landscape across the country. So what is RCV in the most simplest terms?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges, especially for proponents of ranked choice voting, has been trying to define what RCV is in simple terms. And I think the first thing that you have to keep in mind when you try and answer that question is ranked choice voting is a term that encompasses a lot of different electoral systems that have some aspects in common. I actually think the easiest way for a layman to wrap their head around what ranked choice voting is to consider a particular type of ranked choice voting, which is actually the most commonly used type of ranked choice voting, which is called instant runoff voting. So ranked choice voting, broadly speaking, is a method of electing candidates that involves ranking candidates on a ballot and tabulating results in multiple rounds. That's kind of where I'm going to leave the general description of RCV and bring in or give a description of instant runoff voting to try and flesh out what that looks like in practice. So in instant runoff voting, it basically does what the name says it does. It provides a method to determine a winner of an election if no candidate for that election receives a majority of the vote. And you can sort of play around with that threshold. There are some jurisdictions that would say that have proposed other standards other than a majority, but I would say majority is the most common sort of threshold used to determine a winner of an election. In instant runoff voting, a voter receives a ballot with as many slots to rank candidates as candidates are up for election in that race. If no candidate receives a majority of first place votes in the first round of voting, then whatever candidate receives the least amount of first ranked votes in that first round is eliminated. And whoever voted for that eliminated candidate as their first choice will then have their second choice on their ranked ballots elevated to their first choice. And then there will be another round of tabulation to determine if a candidate in that new round of that new tally has crossed majority, whatever the threshold is. And that process is repeated until there is a winner determined or until someone crosses that threshold. Again, this is really, I think the keeping in mind the name instant runoff really helps me visualize, at least. I hope it helps the listeners visualize as well. Basically, think of an election that would normally have a runoff afterwards. Candidates run for the office, nobody receives a majority, and then a set period of time later, there's a runoff election between the highest ranked candidates on the ballot. Instant runoff ranked choice voting does that instantly. It provides a way to basically have a runoff included in the initial ballot for the election. I highly encourage folks to go check out our ranked choice voting page on the website. There's a better explanation than I just gave of ranked choice voting, which again uses instant runoff voting to try and describe what the process does. And there's a ton of information about other types of ranked choice voting, including approval voting, proportional representation ranked choice voting. I don't think is totally worth getting into right now.
Jack Santucci, I believe, gets into that later in one of our later episodes in the RCV. Yeah. But give yourself some credit.
It's hard for me to wrap my head around. Sorry to interrupt you. But proportional representation RCV is really where it gets complex.
Yeah, I was going to say just give yourself some credit because that was a great definition. One follow-up question, does RCV, as the way you described it, eliminate primaries, or does it just depend on the type of RCV used?
Yeah, it depends on how the electoral system is actually implemented. It can eliminate primaries if the statute that authorizes or describes that type of ranked choice voting in that particular jurisdiction decides to do so, but it does not always. One thing that we've seen a lot of over the last couple of years is pairing the adoption of ranked choice voting in general elections with top 2, top 3, or top 4 primaries, or top even 5. I don't think I've seen anything bigger than top 5. But yeah, so it can go both ways. It can entirely eliminate primaries. It can be paired with sort of a non-traditional primary system, or it can be used with a traditional primary system.
Well, let's take a snapshot of the current landscape of RCV. Which states use it statewide right now?
The answer is 2.5, kind of. 2 states, really, Alaska and Maine, which use ranked choice voting for a number of statewide offices and for congressional elections in the state, in those states. Hawaii is a bit of an edge case. They do use ranked choice voting for special congressional elections and for certain county elections. So there are statewide uses of ranked choice voting in the state, but it doesn't quite fit the same category, or it doesn't quite reach the level that Alaska and Maine do.
Got it. And it's been adopted at the local level as well. How many localities or how many states have localities that use ranked choice voting?
Yeah, there's been more adoption at the local level than at the statewide level, and that kind of makes sense. Laboratories of democracy, from the federal to the state to the local. So we've seen a lot of local jurisdictions. I don't think play around that's what I was going to say, play around with different types of RCV systems. That doesn't quite, give the proper weight to changing your electoral system. But we've seen localities in 14 different states experiment with ranked choice voting. Most of these localities are using instant runoff voting, to circle back to our description of ranked choice voting at the top. I think there may be a couple localities right now that have authorized proportional ranked choice voting, but I don't think it's in use anywhere. I'd have to fact check myself on that. But yeah, 14 states right now have localities that are using ranked choice voting in one form or another.
Are there any states where RCV is legal but not in use? It's been authorized, but it's not currently being used?
Yeah, Virginia is the real answer there. Theoretically, ranked choice voting is permitted in a number of states that do not currently use it. But Virginia is the only state that has a specific statute on the books that authorizes localities to use ranked choice voting, and no locality actually does. And that's a recent development. Arlington in Virginia did use ranked choice voting until this year. It was just a little bit of an experiment in the city that, according to folks in charge there, did not go as planned, or for one reason or another did not sort of warrant keeping the system around. I think that's a sort of temporary pullback in Virginia. I do think we will see localities. I actually think we'll see Arlington try ranked choice voting again. And then Michigan is actually an interesting case where there is ranked choice voting in use in the state right now in one jurisdiction, East Point, but it's only in use under federal enforcement under the Voting Rights Act, under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. There was a ruling that determined there was discrimination in the East Point local elections. You can read more about that, again, on our ranked choice voting website. I'm not going to get into the actual case right now, but ranked choice voting is not actually authorized in Michigan. There are several other localities in the state, and I will get into this later because there's some local ballot measures that are relevant to this right now. But there are several localities in the state that have basically indicated their preference for adopting ranked choice voting, or said that they would like to adopt ranked choice voting, but state law does not currently allow for ranked choice voting in the state. And that's not because it bans or prohibits ranked choice voting. It's just that the way that election statutes in the state are written, there would need to be new statewide legislation to permit basically new ballot design, ballot counting methods, procurement of new voting equipment, things like that are currently just not permitted under state law. So yeah, Michigan's kind of an odd case there.
Speaking of states that prohibit RCV, are there any? I know that there was a rise in legislation like that after Alaska used it in 2022. So have any states enacted prohibitions against RCV?
Yeah, I think we talked about this earlier in the year a little bit as well. This was sort of a big story in the first half of the year. Not to say that it's less important now, but we definitely saw a wave of states move to ban or prohibit the use of ranked choice voting through statewide legislation this year. 3 states did so this year. Those were Idaho, Montana, and South Dakota, all Republican trifecta states. They joined Florida and Tennessee, who banned the use of ranked choice voting last year in 2022. So now there's a total of 5 states that ban or prohibit ranked choice voting, and that's up from 0 in 2021. So definitely a trend we're keeping an eye on. There was one other effort that really advanced this year to ban, prohibit, repeal ranked choice voting, which was in North Dakota. Currently, one jurisdiction, North Dakota, uses a type of ranked choice voting called approval voting. That's Fargo. There was a bill that passed both chambers of the legislature this year. It was eventually vetoed by Governor Burgum, and a veto override came close to passing, but eventually failed. So yeah, I think we're going to continue to see mostly Republican trifecta states move to, or at least consider banning or prohibiting ranked choice voting moving forward. But I think Governor Burgum's veto is sort of an interesting indicator that just because a state is a Republican trifecta does not guarantee that they'll move to ban or prohibit.
And I guess an interesting note about all of those bans from the ballot measure perspective is that it's not final because they're just state laws. So in states with initiative process, proponents could still put an initiative to enact RCV and override the legislative ban.
Yep.
Speaking of ballot measures, let's get into that. So like you said, 2023, we saw 7 local jurisdictions vote on ranked choice voting. Could you walk us through the election outcomes?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really on your turf with this one, Victoria, but I'm happy to walk through what went down last month. So as you mentioned, we saw 7 local jurisdictions in 5 different states with local ballot measures on the ballot this past November. And this is the second highest number of localities to consider these types of local ballot measures since 1965. I think before we get into the results, I think just talking about what those ballot measures would do is sort of a good introductory step there. So 6 of the 7 would have permitted or authorized the use of ranked choice voting in local jurisdictions. And one of the 7 ballot measures would have repealed the use of ranked choice voting. And we saw, correct me if I'm wrong here, Victoria, because you are the expert here. The 6 jurisdictions that considered adopting all those local ballot measures did pass. And then the one local ballot measure that would have repealed, which is in Minnetonka, Minnesota, failed. Running through localities that voted to adopt ranked choice voting through local ballot measures, we saw 3 jurisdictions in Michigan do so. Those were East Lansing, Kalamazoo, and Royal Oak. Again, back to what we were talking about in Michigan, this is an interesting case because all these jurisdictions will not be able to implement ranked choice voting until some sort of statewide legislation is passed that creates an authorization in state election statutes for ranked choice voting electoral systems. So it's kind of a wait and see right now. There were a couple legislative efforts this year that didn't really move in the state. Michigan's a fairly purple state. I'm kind of not totally positive where the state legislature is going to end up on this. Who knows? Maybe we'll see a statewide ballot measure as well that tries to authorize or tries to implement that statewide authorization. Elsewhere in local ballot measures this year, we saw East Hampton, Massachusetts approve an advisory measure to adopt multi-winner RCV. Multi-winner RCV is synonymous with proportional representation ranked choice voting. Again, I'm not going to get into the description and definition of proportional representation ranked choice voting, but yeah, it is a way to implement ranked choice voting for offices on the ballot with multiple winners. Elsewhere, we saw ballot measures approved in Burlington, Vermont and Redondo Beach, California. Both were authorizations of ranked choice voting for certain offices in those jurisdictions.
The one that repealed RCV in Minnetonka, Minnesota, when did they enact it? Do you know?
So they first adopted ranked choice voting in 2020, again, through a local ballot measure that passed with nearly 55% of the vote. And then the repeal this year was defeated. And I'm actually not positive what the vote total on that was.
I think it was 59%.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it seems like voters in the jurisdiction seem to like the voting method. I don't think that'll be the last time. Well, maybe in Minnetonka, but I definitely think we'll see more local ballot measures to repeal going forward. Again, I'm on your turf with the ballot measures, Victoria, but I do think it's super interesting to try and track sort of voter sentiment, especially at the local level after a jurisdiction has adopted. So
adopted and then used it and then decided how they feel about it. Definitely. Let's zoom out to statewide ballot measures. There are 2 on the ballot in 2024. Can you give our listeners some info on Oregon and Nevada, which will be voting on RCV?
Yeah. Oregon is seeking to become the 3rd state, in addition to Maine and Alaska, as we mentioned earlier, to establish ranked choice voting for a number of statewide elections, including congressional elections, and a number of statewide executive offices, and I believe the state legislative offices as well. And an interesting thing about this Oregon ballot measure, is that it is the first legislatively referred statewide ballot measure that would adopt ranked choice voting. The ballot measures that authorized and adopted ranked choice voting in Alaska and Maine were both citizen-led initiatives. And then in Nevada, we've got question 3 on the ballot in 2024 for the second time. It was on the ballot in Nevada last year for the first time as a proposed constitutional amendment to adopt ranked choice voting and paired with a top 5 primary system as well. And the way constitutional amendments work in Nevada is they need to be approved by voters in 2 subsequent elections. So this will be the second approval coming up next year. Just on sort of prospects for both of those measures, I think both are, I wouldn't say guaranteed by any means, but both have decent prospects of passing. Again, I don't think it makes a ton of sense to sort of bifurcate sentiment about ranked choice voting into Democratic and Republican camps. I do think there are interesting sort of crossover examples, Republican states that have authorized and used ranked choice voting in a lot of interesting ways. Utah, I think, is a leader there. We talked about Governor Burgum's veto of a repeal this year. And then we saw a statewide ballot measure to adopt ranked choice voting in Massachusetts fail. So it's a Democratic, well, they were not a trifecta at the time, but they are a Democratic trifecta now, fail in 2020. So it's not sort of a guarantee that adoption of ranked choice voting will be approved in Democratic states and rejected in Republican states. I do think the prospects are decent in Oregon, though. And again, for question 3 in Nevada, it did pass. I think it was around 52%. In 2022. So the margins are relatively thin, and it'll be interesting to see where that lands. But I would say decent chance of passing for the second time next year.
So those are the 2 that are on the ballot. But what about potential measures we may see in other states?
We saw potential ballot measures filed in a couple of other states as well, Arizona, Idaho, and Missouri. Idaho is really interesting because, again, as we mentioned earlier in this conversation, they've just recently adopted through state legislation. So sort of an interesting referendum on actual citizen sentiment. And we'll see if they agree with their elected officials or if they feel differently. And that's also paired with I think, top 4 primary system as well. I think down the line, it would be really interesting to sort of compare ballot measure success of like standalone ranked choice voting adoption versus ranked choice voting adoption paired with novel primary system. I don't think there's a huge sample on that right now, but it'd be an interesting question to look at. And then, elsewhere, Arizona and Missouri, and we could see more. Arizona was another state where there was a ban on ranked choice voting in the legislature this year that went pretty far. Passed both chambers of the legislature and was vetoed by Governor Hobbs. I think in the purple states in particular, we're seeing a sort of push and pull on ranked choice voting, and more to see, more to play out over the next year.
Definitely. That's all the questions I have for you, but do you have any final thoughts on RCV before I let you go that you want to let our listeners in on?
Ooh, man. Not any crazy thoughts. I think, again, the most interesting applications of RCV right now, actually, I'm maybe a bit biased because I am in the state of Utah right now, but I think some of the more interesting current uses of ranked choice voting are ones that don't get a ton of attention. And I think Utah's municipal ranked choice voting pilot program, which sees ranked choice voting being used, I think it's more than 20 jurisdictions across the state. Again, in a Republican trifecta state, is super interesting. And I'm just sort of curious to see how sentiment develops in Republican states in particular around ranked choice voting. And then, on the Democratic side as well, I think there's a chance that there's always a chance with ranked choice voting. One of the things about ranked choice voting is that it doesn't necessarily burden incumbents. It doesn't make it's not clear that it makes it more difficult on incumbents to win re-election, but there's definitely a preference we've seen in states with strong partisan control to reject or try and ban or repeal the use of ranked choice voting. And that's sort of a biased towards incumbency. Anyways, I could ramble about it for a little bit. I think voter sentiment is the really interesting thing, especially in places where ranked choice voting has been adopted. Do voters like it? Do they understand it? Do they want to see it continue to be in use in their elections? Do voters in local jurisdictions that have used RCV want it to be adopted at the statewide level? There's all sorts of sort of interesting dynamics around voter sentiment. And I think we're only going to get more and more information about that in this upcoming year.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks for coming on and sharing your expertise with our listeners.
Thank you so much, Victoria. I hope I didn't ramble too much, and it's always fun to be on the show.
And for our listeners, you can check out Ballotpedia's coverage of RCV by clicking on the link in our show notes. In our next installment, I'll be interviewing Deb Otis of Fair Vote to unpack the arguments in favor of RCV. Next week, I'll be interviewing Trent England from Stop RCV to walk through the arguments against RCV. And in our final installment of RCV Explained, I'll be interviewing Jack Santucci from Queens College City University of New York to dive deeper into the history and future of RCV. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for listening.